right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to today's webinar on coordinating cybersecurity risk with hardware and software vendors. This is the final webinar in our 10-part series on cybersecurity and digitalization with a focus on supply chain cybersecurity in the energy sector. I am Scott Morgan, Principal Consultant with Enernex, and I will help moderate today's webinar. So thank you all for joining us. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and that all participants have been muted. The recording will be made available after the webinar, along with a PDF of the presentation slides. We will be taking questions via the Q&A window, and we'll have time for Q&A after the presentation. So if you have questions during the presentation, please type them into that Q&A window. Note, these questions are only shared with presenters and hosts, and if we don't get to your question during the webinar, we will follow up with you and try to provide an answer afterwards. Today's event is organized through the U.S. Energy Association's Advancing Modern Power Through Utility Partnerships, or AMP-UP program. The AMP-UP program is funded by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. And as I mentioned a moment ago, today's webinar is part of our 10-part series. The overarching goal of this series is to discuss the cybersecurity challenges associated with the expanding supply chain necessary to address multiple transformations in the energy sector, including integration of renewables, deployment of grid edge technologies, integration of regional markets, etc. In today's webinar, we will hear from Claudia Iannazzo and from Catalysto and Sakal Mukai from Kesh. Claudia is the CEO and founder of Catalysto, a provider of cybersecurity sourcing, testing, and capacity development services to critical infrastructure stakeholders globally. Claudia herself is a specialist in cybersecurity solution sourcing and vendor risk management, with over 25 years experience on technical systems integration programs across the globe. Sakal is the Chief Information Officer at Kesh, the Albanian Power Corporation, which is the country's largest electricity producer. Kesh operates nearly 80% of the generation capacity in Albania, primarily from large hydropower plants, as well as guarantees security of Albanian energy system through balancing energy and auxiliary services. Claudia and Sakal have been collaborating on a project under USEA's Just and Secure Energy Transition, JSET program, a project of the USAID, US-Europe Energy Bridge, which fits nicely with our topic today of coordinating with vendors on addressing cybersecurity risks. So before I turn it over to them, just a quick reminder to our audience, please enter those questions during the presentation via that Q&A window. And if you don't hear an answer along the way, we'll have time after the presentation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Claudia. If you would please share your screen and take it away.
Sure. Thank you so much for the introduction. And hi, everyone. Sorry about my crazy accent. I am Australian, so please forgive me and please let me know if you need me to speak slower. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Looks good. Thanks.
Terrific. So team, thank you for giving me a chance to, Sakal and I, a chance to talk to you about cybersecurity risk management with the technologies that you have implemented. I personally think this is the most exciting bit of cybersecurity. I understand not everybody shares my enthusiasm, but I think this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where it gets very, very real for IT teams. So today, we're going to use a case study that Sakal and I have been working together on, a project that we've been working together on with USAID and USEA, who are the prime contractors. We're a subcontractor to them. And it's under the Energy Bridge program, which focuses on assistance countries in Europe and Eurasia. We're going to go over vendor negotiations and what to talk about in the negotiations. What is reasonable to ask for? We're going to talk about risk management when you're actually starting to install that software or that technology. We'll talk about vendor management after initial implementation. And then finally, we're going to talk really quickly about vendor offboarding It's something that we see is if it's not done properly, you can definitely, unfortunately, feel the negative impacts of that later on. So we'll talk about this. Briefly to introduce you to the team, USAID Energy Bridge is a program that funds a range of innovative development programs designed to develop the capacity of energy operators across Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the Caucasus countries, including Albania. We're going to specifically discuss today a range of initiatives that we have been working on under the Just and Secure Energy Transition Program, which is a 5-year program that is led by USEA. KESH is the Albanian National Generation Services Operator, and as Scott mentioned, I'm joined today by Sakol Mukai, who is the CIO of the operator, who we have been working closely with. I'm the CEO of Catalysto. We're a cybersecurity provider that specializes in the types of programs that resource-constrained critical infrastructure operators can use. So with teams across the world, we focus on unconventional approaches that meet the need of operators who may lack financial, human capacity, and technology resources that organizations in wealthy countries such as the US typically have access to. So our philosophy, what makes us a little bit different in how we come at technical projects, is we believe there are always low-cost options that you can use to improve your cybersecurity posture. It's just that most IT teams or OT teams don't have the time to research, screen, and implement those processes. So that's where our expertise comes into play, and that's what we're really excited to share with you today. We have a whole raft of proprietary databases on cybersecurity solutions and providers. We have cybersecurity experts across the globe. We do not just monitoring, but we support operators with incident response, and systems integration. So as we talk today, I'm going to share with you some stories about issues we've been dealing with other operators. Okay. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Sakol to give you a little bit more information about KESH and who they are and what they do. Sakol, over to you.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you for your introduction. So hello, everyone. I am from Albania, as Scott already mentioned, and from KESH. KESH is the Albanian Power Corporation, which is declared by law as one of the critical infrastructure operators in the country. It is the public and the largest producer of electricity in Albania, and it supplies nearly 80% of the production capacity. With over 700 employees that are spread out all over the Drin River, power plants which are in the northern part, and also to the headquarters in Tirana, is responsible for providing grid balancing and operation services in the transmission network, as it strongly relies on renewable energy sources such as hydro and solar. Its foundation started in 1957 and is a state-owned joint stock company. The corporate is resource constrained as it's strongly based on water inflow levels in the reservoirs, with seasons moving from high inflow during winter and spring to dry months during summer. Claudia?
Yeah, Sakal, so tell me, as an operator, so every CIO I've ever spoken with, whether they come from a big company or a small company, always feels when we talk about cybersecurity that they need more of something, right? In your case with KESH, if you had a fairy godmother and you could ask for anything to help you improve your cybersecurity posture, what would it be? Would it be people or funds or particular solutions? What do you think about when you think about the challenges that you experience?
Yes, actually right now we're a team of 15 people. We were focused basically on Tirana headquarters and each hydropower plant with a support specialist. Cybersecurity in our country is a hot topic for the moment. Up until the large-scale attack we had on 2022, when our government services were shut down, cybersecurity was a foreign concept for management, and it still is difficult to find specialized and certified people in the subject. Budget at the same time is restricted, and we lack regulatory means to satisfy our needs that we currently have to accommodate investments in cyber. This is specific to the critical infrastructure, as we are under continuous attack tentatives from different factors based on geographical nations.
Right. So this is, Sakal, that is exactly what we hear from pretty much every operator in an emerging country, but also I hear it from US operators as well. It's really similar problems. It's just often they have an easier time with budget. But the other issues, not the right regulatory environment, can't find the right specialists. Those are really common issues. So let me tell you about why we care about this bit of risk management, this supply chain risk management. So, and I'm going to use an example from last year. And I don't know if any of you know about this particular case, but it started back in March of 2023, where an employee of a telecommunications company called 3CX, they provide telco equipment, VoIP machines, VoIP systems, etc. So the employee is at home on their personal computer, nothing to do with the company. And obviously they decide to get into a little bit of futures trading. And so they mistakenly download a malicious version of Xtrader software. It's a trading platform. And what that software does is, unfortunately, if they had downloaded the authorized version of the software, maybe from Trading Technologies, which is the company that produces the software, if they'd gone to Trading Technologies website and downloaded the authorized version, they might have been okay, but instead they downloaded a Trojanized version. And the Trojanized version had an installer that was malware essentially, but it looks like legitimate software. So downloaded this malware onto their computer. And 2 days later, it's only 2 days later, the 3CX system records an attacker coming in through the company's VPN, using that employee's credentials and getting into the system. So 3CX obviously had conditional access set up. It was tied to their VPN. The attacker came through an authorized path into the company's network. Then what happened was the attacker, oh, excuse me, don't know what just happened there. The attacker starts to load what's called a dynamic link library payload, malicious payload. And what that does is, and they download it into, and basically they corrupt the 3CX web application. So when this software is executing, maybe on one of its 60,000 clients, when the software executes, instead of the software querying a legitimate dynamic link library, it queries a location where the malicious software has been put at the start of the queue of those locations that would ordinarily be checked by the software. And so it downloads essentially malware onto the user's computer. So we first see this is called a DLL sideloading attack. We first see that attack from the Xtrader application. That's how the adversaries get into the employee's personal computer. They go into 3CX, they drop another payload, and they corrupt 3CX's application. And then other companies download 3CX's legitimate application, but that is now an infected application. And they are downloading from an authorized vendor essentially what is now malware onto their own computers. And then the attacker used the same technique to then access the end users network. And there was a case of a US energy operator that was compromised and breached as a result of this technique. There was a European energy operator. There were some crypto exchanges. So, you know, the researchers feel very strongly that that particular individual was targeted by this adversary group, a kind of a sophisticated nation-state sponsored adversary group, in order to get into 3CX, in order to get into 3CX's customer base. And so, you know, what was the motivation for the attack? Well, it looked financial because they tried to extort money from the victims in order to get their data back, in order to get control of their applications. But this particular state actor is very interested in espionage and gathering information and potentially disrupting democratic processes like elections and the proper operation of government. So really serious attack that came straight through the supply chain. And what we're going to talk about today, I'm not going to talk about how you avoid this type of attack. I'm going to talk about the type of information and details you need to have so that you can appropriately recover from this type of attack. Because we're all going to have this experience. So let me take you to the next page. So let me talk quickly about our program with Kesh. And I know you've covered parts of these processes in previous webinars. But we started by developing a detailed specification criteria for the type of technology solution that Kesh needed, which is a mixture of software and hardware. This is to deal with a particular cybersecurity issue they had. We then issued the RFP out to about 70 vendors, all the big names, but a lot of the smaller names that you might not have heard of, names that you know, provide really good solutions, but they're smaller companies. But because they're trying to make their way in these very big markets, they have a really good customer base. The ones we ended up going with had a very strong customer base in energy particularly. And their price point was about a third of what the big names that you would recognize were offering. So we find it's really helpful to go out to a very, very wide potential vendor group so that you can get better pricing, which at the end of the day means the solution is much more sustainable for operators like Kesh. So we ran the RFP process, and we ran it in really close collaboration with Sakal and his team. So they were approving the specification. We asked the vendors to respond to the specification. We asked risk questions. We then compiled a selection rubric, basically a giant Excel spreadsheet that had all of the answers from each vendor that responded side by side with each other. So we could score them and see which answer we liked most. But the other thing that was really important is some of the vendors, even the ones who didn't win the the solicitation, brought up some really interesting approaches that we thought were very useful and thoughtful, and we wanted to ask the preferred vendor, that in this case was also the cheapest vendor, we wanted to understand if they did the same things or not. So it's important to look at all of the responses. And then we made a recommendation to SOCOL and to USCA about which vendor we thought we were recommending to proceed with, but at the end of the day, it was really Kesh's choice as to which vendor we proceeded with, because they have to live with the vendor long term. So Carl, for Kesh, is this a very standard process that you go through when you're procuring hardware and software? Like, how does this process that Catalysto took you through differ from what your own team or your own procurement team do?
Yes, Claudia. So the attention to details with the Catalysto project and the strict schedule and keeping the schedule was a strong attribute of the projects. Here, the experience is different in our country, but the team at Catalysto has kept us on top of the project by having weekly meetings and follow-up tasks, so we had no delays overall. The experience was very good, and we liked how you initiated the process and went into detail in every step. I could say that things are done different in Cash, and I hope we had this project with Catalysto and really learned and gathered a lot of experience from this project. So thank you.
Pleasure. I mean, obviously, you know, on this program, you have the advantage of our team and our resources. But I imagine when you're doing this with your own team have like a full day and night jobs. So how do you go about doing detailed selection criteria, etc. at Kesh? Is that something that the IT team have to do, or is it something that the procurement team really do?
Yes, the IT team usually take care of developing a template for the RFP on what specific prerequisites we have to offer for the vendors, and the legal process is held by the procurement department, which is a different structure of the company.
And so you have to, your technical need then just goes into a big pipeline of all the needs from all the different departments across Kesh, right? So you're just one of many, whereas with Catalysto, you're the only one. And right. So that's why you're saying we move faster, because we probably don't get stuck in that big pipeline. But one of the things we try to do in these processes when we're working with operators like Kesh is we've got templates that we have developed from doing this many, many, many times. And so what we're trying to do in these projects is give Kesh and give our partners those templates, show them how we use them, and then hopefully those become helpful templates for your team, Sakal. When you are doing this on your next program, you can just use the templates that we developed for you.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so Carl mentioned attention to detail. So let me talk to you a little bit about critical information you need to get from the vendor. And it can either be during that RFP response process, or it can be during your negotiations, but you can't sign a contract on a technology implementation without knowing these things. And I'm going to give you a couple of stories about issues we've had to deal with when we've gone in to do incident response with different entities. So the vendor details, right? You are going to have to ask in the process whether the vendor uses any third-party providers or outsourcing to deliver the software to you. And let me explain why this is important. You're going to, and not just ask them if they do, but where are those resources based? And I'll give you a really good example. So we've been working in Eastern Europe since 2019, in Ukraine, in Moldova, in all the countries through that region. And we have been working for the last couple of years since the Russian invasion of Ukraine with many operators who have been shocked to find that the vendors they thought were from country X were actually using a back office that was based in Moscow. And because these sanctions then were imposed, that really impacted their own operations. And so I spoke with an energy operator just a couple of months ago who was really frustrated because you know, they're not very pro-Russian, but one of their key systems is still to this day being maintained from Moscow, and they're very, very concerned about it. So you need to know, where is the support team located? Where is the development team located? Which countries? It's not unusual for tech vendors to have to answer those questions. Okay, and so don't feel shy in asking them. The other thing you need to know is, what is the name, email, and contact telephone number, like emergency contact telephone number of their Chief Information Security Officer. So in the event that you are this energy operator who gets compromised through their VoIP telco provider, do you know who to call in your telecommunications company, right? Do you know the name of the person? Do you know how to get in contact with them? Now, a lot of vendors, software vendors included, don't like to provide those details because they want you to raise a ticket in their online system and wait for 24 hours for a response. But if they are under attack, you're not going to get a response. And if you are under attack, you can't wait 24 hours. You need to be speaking with someone now. So ask for that information. Reputable vendors will totally understand why you're asking for it, and they will give it to you. Okay. Then when you make sure you understand the technical solution, how it works, is it cloud-based? What does the hardware needs? What does it integrate with? Does it have any open source software in there or community-based resources? Don't get me wrong, I love open source. Open source or freeware is can be great, especially if you don't have a lot of financial resources. So, but you just need to know it's there. Where is it collecting data from, right? What if your data is going to be stored in this system? And what other systems is it integrating to, and where is it pushing that data? Where is the data stored? How long is it kept? Do they have backups of data, or do you need to have backups of data? And do you have backups of the system configuration? Let's just say this was your antivirus, right? Maybe you're using a managed detection and response security agent. And you spend a lot of time writing rules and training that system not to provide false positives. Is all of that information being backed up somewhere? Or if you get compromised, if that software gets compromised, you have to reinstall the antivirus for whatever reason, do you lose all of that knowledge? So those are the kind of things you need to think through. This one, you would be shocked. Authentication. Does the system provide multi-factor authentication for administrators? You would be shocked how many great systems from really world-class vendors do not have multi-factor authentication still as a feature on their platforms. So that should not be the end of the world. You may have to put in a multi-factor authentication solution in order to use that system safely. But you have to ask the question. I was, give you another example. At Catalysto, we do a lot of US government work. And so we have to comply with all these really complicated regulations in how we operate our business and how we keep records, etc. And I was thinking about moving us to a new financial system. And you know, I'm thinking, well, these are all government vendors. They know what dealing with the government is like. They know that the US government requires us to have multi-factor authentication on our key systems. And so I just on the off chance asked them if their system had multi-factor authentication for their administrators, and it didn't, right? And as a result, we told the vendor that we didn't want to get a separate MFA system. So we told the vendor that we would have to wait until they had written that functionality, and then we could consider them again. So we put the project on hold, and we'll have another look next year. So other ways you can get around this is if it has an integration with Active Directory or single sign-on, but how the system authenticates is really important. Okay. In your RFP packages, what are the cybersecurity questions you should ask? And I will tell you, I'm responding at the moment to an RFP that's been issued by Meta, right? The company that owns Facebook. And their vendor due diligence questionnaire is very, very long, right? Very, very detailed. But most of us don't have the buying power of Meta. And so we kind of can't ask that level of detail of questions. So I would say in your RFP, if you want vendors to respond, if you want providers to respond, you have to make sure you keep these questions kind of in that Goldilocks zone, right? Not too many questions, not too few questions. So here are the questions that we like to ask. And I'm sure your procurement teams have their own questions, but let me explain why we ask these. We like to ask if a company has a particular standard that they like to operate to. You know, these are security standards I've listed here. And we also like to confirm whether they are independently audited to that standard or whether they're just self-assessed. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think compliance is the same as security. And we work with clients all the time who have fabulous policies and loads of certifications and are completely insecure, right? So that's not why we're asking it. We're asking it to understand what is the level of kind of organizational maturity of the vendor, right? The more kind of mature they are, the more they'll have these certifications. So it's really just understanding what is the level of maturity and therefore risk that we need to plan for. I'll give you a really good example. We do not, Catalysto does not have ISO 27001 certification. It's not something we need ourselves, but we would argue that we're far more secure than most of our clients. But we do meet some other standards that are up here. How many successful cybersecurity attacks has your organization experienced in the last 2 years? And the worst answer you can get from this is none, because none means one of two things. None could mean we don't know of any attacks. They've probably happened. We're not aware of them. Or it could mean that we've had attacks, but we're not going to tell you, right? Both are problematic. I much prefer to get a response that says, look, we had one last year. This is what happened. This is how we've dealt with it. This is what we've learned from it, right? I read a report somewhere that 60% of companies have experienced a breach and don't know it. So I'm much more interested in organizations that have been able to detect a breach, right? And detect the attack, even if they didn't take any information out of the system. When was the last time your technical solution was manually penetration tested? Now, when we cybersecurity specialists use that term, we're talking about there are human specialists involved in the test. It's not completely automated. And the reason for that is people use this terminology really incorrectly. So I have seen people call vulnerability scans done by an automated scanner. I've seen them call that penetration testing, and it's not. That is just simply scanning your network or scanning your external attack surface to work out what the known vulnerabilities are. And that's using an automated tool. Not every organization does manual pen testing. And even if they do, it's probably not every year, but it's good to know where they're at. What level of sophistication are they at? Okay. And so you want to ask this question in two parts. Number one, has your technical solution been manually penetration tested? And has your organization, your corporate systems been manually pen tested? All right, so two different questions. Number five, this really is something for critical infrastructure operators. We recommend it. I know there are PII and GDPR issues with asking these questions, but we believe that critical infrastructure operators, such as energy operators, have a legitimate need to know. So we do ask the vendor whether they will agree to disclose the name, the nationalities, and the country of residence of all people who work on implementation programs, right? Now, that is because, let's say we're working on a program in Ukraine, right? It would be inappropriate for us to have individuals who are Russian nationals or resident in Russia at the moment working on that program. And because of the conflict between the two countries, and not to say that every Russian resident or every Russian national is going to be associated with the government or be doing something they shouldn't be doing, but they can be subject to their local government influence, and that could put them in a risky position. So we do ask these questions about nationality. And, you know, depending on where you are and who you are, you know, the countries that you're going to be sensitive to are going to be different. So the countries that US energy operators are sensitive to are very different from the countries that your own country may be sensitive to. And then finally, will you ask to sign an NDA with the operator to ensure any information disclosed during implementation or otherwise is kept in confidence? You may not think this is necessary, but trust me, it is, because reputable vendors will agree to this. Vendors who are sharing the information, maybe they're selling information to a third party, they won't agree to this. And you really need to know. And you can't rely just on your procurement contract, because very often with software and hardware providers, you're not actually signing your own terms and conditions, you're signing their terms and conditions. So get that NDA in place separately. We have signed these NDAs with all the big names, right? We sign them with Juniper and IBM and Cisco, and, you know, we really, none of them will push back on signing an NDA with you. If you ask, they won't offer it unless you ask. Okay, some other checks you should do before you close the deal with that vendor. We always go to the Office of Foreign Assets and Control, and we just check the name of the vendor and the name of the vendor's CEO. And often if there's an owner or a founder, we put it in here and we just check whether the service provider is listed. It's super easy database to use. The other one that's really good to use is the United Nations Security Council Consolidated List. This will help you identify whether there are any sanctions that you need to be aware of and think about before you sign that contract. Sanctions are super complicated to understand. This website's really helpful to understand if you're breaching a sanction that maybe the United Nations have or your own country has with another country. So really, really useful. The National Vulnerability Database. Okay, this is one of my absolute favorite databases. And I am just going to open up this screen and I hope you can see it. Can you guys see a page loading here?
Yep. All
right.
Got it now.
National Vulnerability Database. So before you sign that contract for that piece of hardware or for that software, come here and check whether it's got a large vulnerability. So let me give you an example. We're installing Cisco Meraki firewalls at one particular client's location. So I'm going to put in Cisco Meraki and see what it pops up. Okay. So this tells me that there are 3 big CVEs, so big vulnerabilities that have been discovered. It tells me kind of the level of severity, right? This 8.6 on the second one, 7.8 on the high one. And I can see when it was published, right? This first one, it's published in March 2023. So I'd look at that and I go, okay, I would expect Cisco to have fixed this by now, right? And so you can go in and it will tell you what the issues are. You can go and look at the advisory from the vendor and the patch. You can see what the problem was. You can see which software is impacted. And you can go then link into the vendor advisory and see if there's a patch available for it, right? And then you just need to make sure that whatever you're installing has that patch on it, or if it doesn't have it at the moment of install, you'll have to update that, very soon after installation, so that you've got the most recent version. Okay. So super important to understand whether these things exist. National Vulnerability Database is your friend. It's produced by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, I think it is. It's a US government department. It's completely free, and security specialists and providers and vendors use this addictively. So this is a really important database. Unfortunately, just for your reference, it is experiencing a backlog at the moment. So not every vulnerability that has been disclosed is appearing there, but there is measures in place for it to catch up, and it's usually pretty good and pretty relevant. All right, so you're in the negotiations, and just having a quick look at time. We're in the negotiations. You're going to read the vendor's responses to your cyber questions, ask them any follow-up questions. You should do reference checks. And I always like to ask for reference checks in similar industries. So in your cases, it might be energy operators, right? Do you have any other clients in energy? Can we speak with them? And then when we do those reference checks, we ask them, not do you think the vendor's good or bad, right? Because what vendor gives you a reference that is bad? But we ask them questions like, what are the things we should do in order to get the best value out of the vendor? Or can you explain the implementation process that they took you through, right? So don't ask them black and white questions, ask them process questions. You'll get more insight out of that, and where there may be bumps, It's not that every bump means you're not going to go with the vendor, but it will impact how you design your implementation plan. Do a vendor risk assessment. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then, you know, if you are seeing something with the vendor that you think needs to be fixed, make sure you contractually oblige them to fix it. So we like to write all those commitments into the statement of work. And then, you know, you'll almost always need to update your specifications document that you issued with your RFP and contractually bind the vendor to those items by including those items in your statement of work, right? So don't just have them be a document that's in your RFP and hope that it's implied that they will comply with it. You need to contractually get them to comply with it. Okay, vendor risk assessment. Catalysto has given to USEA our vendor risk assessment template. So you're really welcome to download that. But here are some of the questions that we ask. We have like this huge library of questions that we draw from. But, you know, again, you don't want this to be a 15-week process. You want this to be, it can be as simple as having your questions in an Excel spreadsheet, emailing that spreadsheet over to the vendor, asking them to complete the spreadsheet, and then having a 30-minute interview with them just to go through their answers and make sure you understand it, right? So these are some of the questions that we ask. IT technical teams, you know, you want to have a sense of how robust is their cybersecurity strategy, awareness, and controls. Good example of this was we were doing one sourcing project and we were working through a local reseller partner. And when we got the reseller partner to complete this vendor risk assessment, we didn't like the answers, right? The answers were things like, oh, we don't need a cybersecurity program because we all use Macs. Well, sorry, that's not going to work. So we really wanted the technical solution, but we talked to the reseller and we said, look, we can't give you any sensitive information about this particular operator because you don't have a proper security program. So do you mind, we still want to order the product through you, but do you mind if we correspond only with the technical vendor, the product provider? And so they were fine with it. We then got non-disclosure agreements directly in place with the provider. And we got the reseller to agree that we wouldn't send them any technical information or anything that was sensitive. So negative responses on the risk assessment are not the end of the world. You just need a strategy for how you're going to manage that risk. We talked about developers and operations personnel being compromised or adversarial jurisdictions. Super important to ask. Reputational risk, just something for your reference. We always Google vendors and partners before we sign contracts with them to see if maybe there are allegations of corruption in dealing with them, or maybe there's a class action. And then we may have to have a risk management process around how we're going to deal with that. Credit and financial risk. So a lot of vendors, when you say, hey, how much profit do you make each year? Or how much is your revenue? They'll say, thank you, but that's company confidential. We're not going to give you that information. So instead, sit down with the vendor and explain the problem, right? We would love to use you, but we've always got to worry about whether you're going to go out of business next week, right? Especially if it's a startup company. Talk to us, help us get comfortable with your level of financial or credit risk. And you'll usually find in that context, they will start to tell you many of these elements. Think about operational risk. So this came up on a project just a couple of months ago. We were dealing with, the preferred vendor was an Israeli vendor. right? And at the time we issued the RFP, this was before October 7th, we weren't even really thinking about the risks of an Israeli vendor. And then October 7th occurred and we're like, okay, stop. We now have to think about what happens if this particular vendor loses their people to the army, or maybe their electricity network gets interrupted and they can't operate. So we had to sit down with them and go through in detail with them their business continuity plan. Now, this particular vendor, they're like, oh, we're good. We have people in Ukraine, Armenia, and there was one other location. But all those locations were considered at-risk locations. So that wasn't really a good business continuity plan. So as part of our negotiations with them, we required them to update their business continuity plan and get a backup option. And they chose to pick another country to have a backup dev shop in, should they need it. And on that basis, we could move forward with them, with one of our energy clients. But if they had not agreed to that backup option, unfortunately, we couldn't allow the situation that was occurring in the Middle East to become a situation for an entire country. But in this case, the vendor was great, came up with an alternative plan. So you really do have to ask these questions when you're engaging technology vendors. Okay, I'm conscious of our time, so I'm going to move on quickly because Sokol's risk assessment process, which he does in addition to the process that we do, I want you guys to hear it because it's really good. Before we get to that, for major projects, we recommend you write up what we call implementation plans. And you'll be able to get this, this page from the presentation that'll be on the USEA website. This is an actual index page, but you can see what we do is we write down everything relating to the program. Who are the organizations? Who are the key points of contact? When are we going to have our project meetings? What are our reporting? What are our emergency communications? Blah, 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 right? Everything gets written down so that there is no ambiguity about what is being implemented, who is doing what and when they are doing it. We've made sure everyone knows what the change management and change notification requirements are. And it's really, really clear that the customer is going to sign an acceptance certificate. And sometimes we even include the exact form of the acceptance certificate and the exact tests that we're going to do before we will accept the technology solution. So this is just a list of things. It's a living document. You update it throughout the project. Things change, you need to update it. And then just before you close the project, you update it again. And what this becomes is a really important record of how the implementation was done, why certain decisions were made. Because if you're in a resource-constrained environment, you may lose people on your journey. And the new people need to know what the reason was for the decisions that the previous people made. And that can be really, really hard unless you are using an implementation planning process and documenting it, okay? Now I want to hand over to Sokol because one of the really, I was so happy to see that Kesh had their own risk assessment process. And so while we were writing up our implementation plan, Sokol sent me over their risk assessment of the vendors and the solutions that we were proposing. And it was really useful because I could look at what he had looked at and change how we were going to implement to make sure that we manage the risks of these things. So Sokol, maybe I can get you to present here, like what your risk process is. And maybe you could also give us some context on why is it you have this risk process? I mean, you are seriously the only operator I've ever seen who's done this and sent it to us. So it would be great to understand.
Thank you, Claudia. So basically, we're required to have a risk assessment. By some specific laws, we have a critical infrastructure that's to apply that ISO standards also for the cybersecurity prerequisites. We had some new projects regarding solar panels that we had to implement on our company, and the main producer of the panels was from China, so we had to take some assessment on what the company had and what kind of certifications. And so basically, after that, we created a template on what risk assessment analysis we should make for every new project. So basically, we conduct a search for the vendor based on their geopolitical factors. If they have specific breaches of security, they are not exploits on their products, what certifications they make use of, and how compliant they are to standards in energy sector or also in IT. Then we analyze what the technical documentation they propose to us, what data is gathered by the system, if it's sent to a specific location outside our network, what protocols and ports they use if they send this data. And then we have a summarized assessment of what the risks are, divided by different levels based on what we have achieved from the first part. Some example of analysis of a network topology that can show potential threats to an existing infrastructure can be unauthorized access to the system, data breaches, malware, man-in-the-middle attacks, etc. After the analysis is concluded, we then come up with findings. For example, in a new project, we see no security perimeter because there are no boundary firewalls on the proposed technical document. And this was the case that we had with solar panel producer. We also see lack of network segmentation for connected services, which could lead to parallel movement attack types. In cases when the vendor needs remote access to the system on a non-segmented network that will have direct access to the internet could become a risk. Also, connection to the cloud is a risk factor that comprises of data exposure to the internet that can compromise the whole SCADA system because of the need to interconnect between the SCADA and the monitoring of the PV. So after assessing and analyzing the cybersecurity, we provide recommendations to the vendor that they can follow in order to have a more comprehensive security design and to reduce the threats. Similar recommendations can include items such as access control restrictions to authorized personnel only, compulsory usage of strong passwords, multi-factor authentications, and also role-based access control to sensitive data. They can make also use of data encryption of sensitive information through transport protocol security such as SSL, TLS, and especially VPN connectivity when there is need to go in their internet and also connect to the cloud, which is required in these cases. For sure, we require vendors to conduct regular backups of critical data that should be taken in order to ensure that there is low downtime and also the return to service is fast after a cyber event, keeping in mind that all these backups are tested and stored to a secure location. We do require that all firmware and all firmware software should be kept up to date with the latest patches that will help prevent known vulnerabilities and being exploited by an attacker. Some example of new prerequisite that we have added to this template, there is the usage of next generation firewall devices that will help in prevent intrusion and data breaches, keeping in mind that supported protocols in the OT network are kept within standards. Such standards I can mention is EEC 104 Secure, which we have required to the company and they were not able to provide us. So we didn't go for that company. Also, another specific thing that we make use of is the requirements for IDS and the IPS that are strictly requested in devices connected to the internet. In addition to that, network segmentation in the OT infrastructure, which is a must, where different networks should be spliced into different segments in order to limit the impacts in case of an imminent attack. We recommend that either an antivirus or EDR or XDR should be implemented as a solution that will provide real-time activity and monitoring, and also will detect and offer a response in cases of a cyber threat. So I can mention that other security recommendations we make to the vendors are continuous monitoring of the system, of the infrastructure, in order to detect threat events using a CM integrated solution. We require them to offer secure remote access with the zero trust principle. For example, in a vendor that will need to remotely connect to uninstalled sensors, and all the sessions have to be recorded in order so we can track any maintenance activity that they do on the devices. It's important that we do hardening on the operating systems on every level. We require that making use of community-developed secure configuration guidelines such as CIS benchmarks for different vendor families. And lastly, we strongly require and rely on regular security audits and penetration test activities in order to identify potential threats to such new systems that need to be added into the organization. So I know I've been a bit short to explain a lot of technical details, but these are kind of what we require and what we assess from a cybersecurity perspective on the vendors.
And is that for all vendors, like technology vendors?
Yes. From starting from the issue we had with that specific PV vendor, we're starting on every vendor to require such security.
Yeah, it's great. So finally, post-implementation, super important. Make sure you add the new hardware into your asset inventory, put the new software in your systems inventory. If there's any sensitive data, update your data inventory. Make sure you've thought about whether you need to update your business continuity plan or your incident response processes. And think about whether the vendor is so important that you want to do maybe an annual risk audit or an update. Just for folks sticking stuff in chat, I actually can't see it. So if you could just jump in and let me know, that'd be great. And I know we're running tight on time. So let me just quickly wrap up with offboarding. Make sure you understand the uninstallation process at the end of the contract. This is really important with monitoring agents, because if you don't uninstall it exactly the way the vendor requires it to be installed, the software may prevent you from uninstalling it. So make sure you understand that process. It's not for each vendor, it's really different. And it can be very, very problematic to get rid of this software off your system. And make sure you understand that process of decommissioning and recommissioning to a new vendor. Make sure you have taken backups of the data if you need it. Make sure the data at the vendor site is destroyed if needed, and update all your inventories accordingly. And these are my contact details. If anyone has any questions, please send me an email. I'm really happy to answer them. Okay, Scott, I'm going to hand it back to you for any questions.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, both you and Sakal. So we don't have any in the Q&A at the moment, but just give folks one last chance to add one. I will ask just a question I have here. So I think in a lot of these types of projects, when you get to that deployment phase, when you start to do the integration, I feel like that always has some snags, and you talked about the importance of maintaining that document so that you really understand the as built. I guess, do you see typical snags related to cybersecurity as you go through that implementation, and any suggestions for kind of dealing with them?
Yeah, typical snags. I would say it's like children. There are no two vendors are the same, no two implementing partners are the same. They all have their wonderful uniqueness. What I would say is with smaller vendors, still reputable but less well known, sometimes you find that they just don't have the same level of documentation that the bigger guys like Cisco and Fortinet have. So you're asking them for what their protocols are, and they'll be like, I don't have that information, or I don't know what encryption standard we use. So I do find sending them that questionnaire as early as possible is really important, to give them as much time as possible to answer them. Also, if they're not used to dealing with government contracting or critical infrastructure operators, they may not understand how important it is to understand the answers to these things and have them documented. So, you can get a little bit of pushback sometimes, especially from newer vendors who are just a little bit more immature on their journey, and they need quite a lot of hand-holding to kind of learn why it is that you need this stuff. So yeah, I mean, those are the kind of things we see. We're predominantly focused on doing systems integration on cybersecurity solutions. So Cole, what about on non-cybersecurity issues? Do you come across multiple like common cybersecurity failures with non-cyber vendors and hardware?
Yes, Claudia, here in our country, I mean, you may already know that we have a lot of vendors they have basically no information whatsoever on what cybersecurity is and what measures they have to take for new projects. So I think it's a difficult path for us, at least, when we have projects with locals, and that they win a specific project in a tender, and they have no the project from the beginning had no prerequisite regarding this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
understood. All right,
What do you
well,
do
thank you.
about that, Sakal? Just out of interest, you have a really immature provider who has no cybersecurity. What do you guys do?
In the end, if he wins the tender, then we have to do a contract with them, and we have to suffer the consequences of the decision makers.
So you have to do the risk management on your side.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, it's great. Thank you for that. So one other question. I think you sort of talked about these throughout, really, but can you talk a little bit more about the difference between working with large and small vendors, sort of pros and cons of each?
So, Carl, do you want to go first?
Yes. Difference is, I think, the process from the beginning of the projects. So they don't take into consideration every step of the projects. Small vendors usually wants to finish everything and get paid. So we try to limit what we give them, what information they take from the company. So it's like an ongoing process with them. Big companies, on the other hand, have procedures in place. They follow project management standards, so it's a different approach.
Yeah, we find in cybersecurity in this part of the world, we find a lot of vendors are kind of unrealistic in their pricing, and they'll give an operator price that they think is a cracking price, right? A really good price. And in the US, it would be a really good price. But I don't think they have a lot of an appreciation for how small some of these IT budgets are. I mean, we got an RFP response on something we did recently where the price of the cybersecurity solution from one vendor was more than the entire IT budget for the operator. And, you know, the vendor was very upset that they didn't get down selected. And we kind of had to explain this to them. And so it takes a lot of educating of some of the vendors, even the big vendors, to understand the reality, right, that the regional operators are dealing with. And, you know, there's a couple of these vendors that we're now just working with to help them redesign their product so that it is more suitable for a really financially constrained operator, because they may think $100,000 a year is a great price. But for an operator, that may just be like a ridiculous amount of money that they just cannot accommodate. And so we need to get them to think about, hey, can you offer a solution that is more in the $10,000-$15,000 range? And if you can't, then don't worry, just don't focus on this region because there's no product market fit. And go focus elsewhere. But, you know, some of the bigger vendors, I find they want the operators as customers, but they don't realize how unrealistic their pricing is for them. And unfortunately, they have really aggressive salespeople, excellent salespeople, and they can take up a lot of a CIO's time, right? And there's just a fundamental mismatch on pricing compatibility. So, and the other thing is the vendors never give you the price right out of the gate. You've got to kind of, you know, work with them, coax them, send them a formal price request, then you get the price. And that could be 6 months before you realize that there's just no way you can afford that solution. In the meantime, you've fallen in love with the solution, right? So we're really realistic with vendors now upfront and say, look, if your pricing can't land in this broad area, then this is not the right opportunity.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a really good message for vendors and to appreciate as you go into that procurement process. So this is the final question. I just will ask, do you periodically review the risk assessment of the vendor risk assessment, sort of on an annual, biannual basis, or are there triggers that would cause you to reevaluate?
So Colin, I can tell you what we do. Yeah, so I would love to say we do this every year, but to be honest, we don't. We don't review vendor risk assessments every year just because we're a small business and we don't have capacity to do it ourselves. What I will say though is we're very, very attentive to vulnerabilities that are being released about the products that we use ourselves. And so whenever there's a vulnerability about a solution or a piece of hardware that we use, we assess then. So it's a little bit more on a reactive basis rather than a proactive basis. It's just due to our size being small. We've got about 40 people globally. You know, but if you're a very large operator and this is a really critical solution for you, like Sokol, you were mentioning the solar panel provider. I imagine that is something you might do more on a more scheduled basis.
Exactly. We try to do annually conduct audits, and what results we get from the audit, we reflect it in the security assessments, in the risk assessment documents. For sure, we've just implemented it the last 2 years, so I don't know how many changes there have been from the first document, but I think there were a lot because we had different cases that we found lack of security standards, but we're trying. We do have a problem regarding the OT vendor network, which is pretty difficult to find vulnerabilities on those kind of products. But
Do
yeah,
you do annual risk assessment on all of your vendors or only on some?
we usually have only 3 vendors that provide us a system for the power production, so it's usually we do it every year for them.
Okay. But this is our second series of webinars that is coming 3-4 years after the first. So maybe when we have a third series, we'll have to check in with you and see if what is the trend and how many changes you're making year over year. Well, so yeah, we're quite a bit over time, and I can't thank you both enough for sharing, being so generous with your time, with your experience and your expertise. So let me kind of call it there and just say thank you both. And so we'll move on and remind our audience as we close out here. As usual, the recording of today's webinar is going to be uploaded to USCA's YouTube channel, and a link will be added to the event page along with a PDF of the presentation. And if you've missed any of the previous webinars in the series, please visit usca.org/events to find those webinars and the recordings, or you can go directly to USCA's channel on YouTube. So this was the final webinar in our 10-part series. And I thought a really great capstone that called back to a number of the best practices that we discussed, and it's kind of really great to see them implemented in a real case like that. So if you've been following along throughout the series, I can thank you enough for joining. It's been quite educational for me as we've talked to a range of experts, and I hope you have found some useful knowledge and insights, as well as references to additional materials for further learning. Following the series, we will be developing a written handbook to go along with the recordings, where we capture summaries, discussion points, and links to resources. And I expect USCA will have a launch event once that handbook is complete by the end of the summer. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jamila Amadeo at USAID, who was integral in developing and carrying out this series. Jamila?
Thank you, Scott. And dear Claudia and Sokol, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise with the global utility practitioners. I loved how practical was this webinar with the demonstrations of the National Vulnerability Database as a resource, the practice of interviewing the vendors, the pricing discussion. I feel like we need to have 10 more series just with you on the lessons learned and practical aspects. I am so grateful for your commitment, and to all our presenters who attended our previous webinars to provide valuable knowledge to our partners. to USAID and US Energy Association partners around the world. I also wanted to thank Scott, Tricia, and the rest of the United States Energy Association's team for the hard work and dedication in putting these webinar series together. Thank you for all who joined us today and throughout the 10 webinars we hosted. This is our, as Scott mentioned, second series. So I think there will be a huge demand for the third after this webinar. For those who could not join us in today or earlier webinars, we will be able to put together the handbook, utility handbook, that will be available on the USEA website by the end of the summer. All the materials will be included in that utility handbook. And also there was a question about when this presentation will be made public. It will be posted on the USEA's website in the next few days. So please stay tuned. And thank you so much again, Claudia and Sokol, for the very informative presentation. It was a pleasure to meet you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks again. Have a good rest of your day, and thanks for joining.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Jamila and team.
Thank you.
you.